Story 1. No Escape. A few months ago, my friend Yoko and I went to a girl's house for a sleepover. I didn't know the girl very well. Her name was Emmy and she was a friend of Yoko's. They went to the same school when they were kids. Emmy was a strange girl. She was very quiet and seldom said anything. Her parents went out for the night and we were left alone in the house. We got changed into our pyjamas and sat around trying to tell ghost stories. The problem was, we didn't know very many, and the ones we knew were kind of lame. Then, all of a sudden, Emmy perked up. "I know a good website," she said. She'd opened up her laptop and clicked on one of the bookmarks. We gathered around her and looked at the website. It had a lot of scary stories from all over the world. Emmy scrolled down the page while we stared at the monitor. Yoko pointed to one of the stories. "What's this one?" she said. For a moment, Emmy's face changed to a serious frown. "You're not supposed to read that one," she said. "It's dangerous." "The whole website is creepy," I said. "Is this supposed to be for kids?" asked Yoko. "No," Emmy replied in a serious tone. "It's definitely not for kids. Some of the stories and games are really dangerous, like this one." She clicked on the link for one story. It seemed very strange. There was a picture of a woman with long dark hair, but her face was disturbing. The text said, "The person who wrote this story is not human." "You're not supposed to listen to this story," said Emmy. "Well, so let's not listen then," replied Yoko. "Yeah, let's just go to bed," I said. I had a strange feeling about this site. I mean, where did they get all these weird stories from, and why did they collect them? Who would even make a site like this? There was something very unsettling about the whole thing. Emmy didn't take any notice of us. She pressed play on the video and we heard the start of the story. As soon as I heard that weird voice, it freaked me out. I put my hands over my ears and left the room. Yoko followed straight after. We waited in the bathroom until it was over. I can't remember what the story was about, but I do recall that it was very short. It seemed more like a poem than a story, but it just didn't rhyme. When we came back in, Emmy had a strange look on her face. "See, nothing happened," she said. Not long after that, we decided to go to bed. We were very sleepy. Emmy got into her bed, and I lay down on the floor beside Yoko. We turned off the lights and went to sleep. I always have trouble sleeping when I stay in someone else's house. In the middle of the night, I was awoken by a strange sound. After a minute or so, I realized it was Emmy. She was making small noises in her sleep. It sounded as if she was having a bad dream. I shook Yoko to wake her up. Maybe Emmy shouldn't have read that story before going to bed," she mumbled. I tried to go back to sleep, but Emmy's moans became louder. Then she started talking in her sleep. "How did you find?" she muttered. I nudged Yoko, and we both lay there listening to her. "How did you know?" she muttered. "That must be one weird nightmare," said Yoko. Just as she said that, Emmy suddenly got out of bed. The way she moved was jerky, like a puppet. I saw it, and a cold chill ran down my spine. Emmy had her back to us, and her head was hanging down. Her long black hair was covering her face. She just stood there, facing her bed, moaning softly. And slowly, very slowly, she began to turn. Just then, Yoko flew into a panic. "That's not Emmy!" she hissed. Emmy was still slowly turning. Yoko was staring at Emmy, her eyes wide in fright. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't turn away. I was trembling uncontrollably. In the dim light, I could make out Emmy's face as she turned. It was Emmy's face, but somehow, it wasn't. Her skin was pale, and her eyes bagged out abnormally. Her mouth was distorted, and twisted into an evil grimace. It wasn't Emmy. It was as if her face had been mixed with someone else's. As if someone else was pretending to be Emmy. In a voice that didn't sound human, she whispered,
No escape. You are mine.
I don't remember what happened after that. I think Yoko and I passed out. When I woke up, it was morning. Yoko was lying on the floor beside me, but in the bed there was just a discarded pair of pyjamas. There was no sign of Emmy anywhere. We went downstairs, but the house was empty. We were really freaked out. Yoko and I grabbed our bags and left as fast as we could. We tried to call Emmy on her mobile, but it was out of range. We tried again and again and again, but it was always out of range. Later that evening, we called her home phone number and her mum answered. She said she didn't know where Emmy was either. Yoko and I were terrified. We texted all of our friends, but none of them had heard from Emmy. It was like she had dropped off the face of the earth. The next day, Emmy's parents went to the police and filed a missing persons report. They started a search for Emmy. Most people thought she'd just run away from home. Nobody could find any trace of her. The police came to question myself and Yoko at one point, but there was nothing we could tell them. But we both knew Emmy hadn't run away from home. One day, Yoko came over to my house. We got on my laptop and searched the internet for the scary website Emmy had been reading. With trembling fingers, Yoko clicked on the link. A notice came up on the screen. "This story has been removed," it read. "Do not try to find this story." We searched through the site, but we couldn't find it. Ever since then, I've had trouble sleeping. I'm scared that when I wake up, I won't be here anymore. Story 2. Yuki. One of my relatives passed away suddenly. I'd never met the woman. She had a daughter who was 4 years old. The little girl's name was Yuki. Her father wasn't able to raise her on his own, so he asked my aunt to take care of her. The little girl refused to be left alone and never left my aunt's side. It started to become quite a problem. My aunt couldn't go anywhere without Yuki. She constantly needed attention. Even my aunt's own daughter started to get jealous. One day, my aunt told me that she had to go out of town for a couple of days and asked if I would babysit the little girl for her. I said it would be my pleasure. I lived alone and I could do with some company. So, a few days later, my aunt dropped Yuki off at my apartment. As she was leaving, she took the little girl outside and said, "Yuki, please be good. Behave yourself." When my aunt was gone, I tried to talk to Yuki and play some games with her, but the little girl's behaviour was very strange. She had a teddy bear tucked tightly under her arm and never let go of it. She never smiled, she never spoke. All she ever did was sit quietly in the corner and stare at the wall. It made me kind of uneasy. I was trying to find something that would entertain her. I had just brought a new digital camera and I decided to let Yuki play with my old one. When she saw the camera, her eyes lit up. I showed her how to use it as she went around my apartment taking pictures of everything. There was a bright smile on her face. That evening, I discovered how difficult Yuki was to deal with. Whenever I tried to leave the room, she started crying and screaming out my name. I couldn't leave her alone or she would create a huge fuss. She even insisted on going to the bathroom with me, which was very embarrassing. At bedtime, she refused to stay in the spare room and insisted on sleeping in my bed. I read her a bedtime story and after a while I managed to get her to go to sleep. That was when I noticed her teddy bear. One of its legs was charred and blackened, as if it had been burned. It made me wonder. In the middle of the night, I was woken by a strange noise. When I turned over, I saw that there was something wrong with Yuki. The little girl's body was trembling and shaking. Her eyes were wide open, her teeth were chattering, and her tears were streaming down her cheeks. I held her close and asked her what was wrong. "She's looking at me again," she mumbled. "Who is?" I asked in surprise. "The dark woman," replied Yuki. She wouldn't say anything more. I tried to tell her it was just her imagination, but she kept on shaking her head and whimpering. It took me a long time to get her to go back to sleep. The next day, Yuki was fine again. She loved playing with my digital camera. When it was time for her to go home, I told her she could keep it. She hugged me. Although she didn't say anything, I could tell she was overjoyed. I dropped the little girl off at my aunt's house and stayed to have a cup of tea. My aunt thanked me for her taking care of Yuki. "Poor little thing," said my aunt. "She hasn't said a word since her mother died." I couldn't contain my curiosity. "How did Yuki's mum die?" I asked. A strange look came over my aunt's face. "She died in a fire." "How did the fire start?" I asked. "Well," my aunt hesitated. "It's a very sad story. She committed suicide, you see. Yuki's mother was a very troubled woman. She poured gasoline all over herself and lit a match. She burned herself alive." "Oh my God," I exclaimed. "How horrible!" "Yes," said my aunt. "Her family was so shocked. They hushed it up and pretended it was an accident. We had a small funeral with only close relatives. Yuki wasn't there. She doesn't even know her mother's dead. She thinks her mother is just on a long holiday. We haven't got the heart to tell her the truth." "Poor Yuki," I murmured. My aunt nodded her head sadly. "Poor Yuki." A few days after that, Yuki died. My aunt was trying to change Yuki's behaviour. At night, she forced the little girl to sleep in her own bedroom. Yuki screamed and cried, but my aunt left her there alone and locked the door. In the morning, she found Yuki lying motionless in bed. The poor little girl was dead. Nobody could understand what had happened. There was no determinant of death. There wasn't a mark on her body. She was perfectly healthy. She had just mysteriously died during the night. There was no explanation whatsoever. After the funeral, I went back to my aunt's house. Everyone was very sad. She returned the digital camera I had given to Yuki. I took it home with me. It was something to remember her by, at least. The memory card was full of random photos that Yuki had taken. I browsed through them, wiping a tear from my eye. There were pictures of my apartment, pictures of my aunt's house, flowers, dogs, toys, candy, silly pictures that a child would take. Then, I came to the last picture. My blood ran cold. My hands started to tremble. I wanted to scream, but nothing would come out. The timestamp on the photo showed that it had been taken on the night Yuki died. Here's the last picture that poor little girl ever took with my digital camera. Story 3. The Psychiatrist. I'm a psychiatrist by profession, and over the course of my career, I have dealt with many people who have strange and unusual problems. However, one case in particular disturbed me more than any other. There was a family of 3 who lived next door to me. They were a married couple in their 60s, and they had a son who was about 30 years old. The son was what we call in Japan a hikikomori, someone who is introverted, reclusive, and isolated. Someone who has withdrawn from social contact. We never actually saw the son. People who are hikikomori usually lock themselves away in their rooms and avoid others. I didn't hear about his condition directly from his parents either. I assumed they didn't want to discuss it. In Japan, people are very concerned about appearances, and having a son who is hikikomori is an embarrassment. As the days passed, their son went out less and less. Eventually, he never came out of the house at all. Every night, from his bedroom window, the furious voice of his mother could be heard screaming, screaming, and screaming at him. Whenever I met the poor woman, she smiled and said hello, but the strain was showing in her face. She was becoming pale and haggard. It had been almost 6 years since anyone had seen the son, and one day the father knocked on my door and asked me to come to his house. He knew I was a psychiatrist, and since we were neighbours, I decided to do what I could do to help the family. When we got to the front door, the mother was there waiting for us. She led me upstairs to her son's room. She banged on the door with her fist and shouted, "We're coming in!" Then, she burst into the room and shrieked, "You're going to sleep forever? Get up, you lazy good-for-nothing!" Before I knew what was happening, she grabbed the golf club and started beating the sleeping figure under the covers. For a moment, I was struck dumb as she rained down blow after blow. Then, I sprang into action, grabbing the golf club and wrestling her out of the room. I hurried back inside to check her son's injuries, but when I pulled back the bed covers, I couldn't believe my eyes. Lying beneath the sheets was a mummified corpse. I stood there in absolute astonishment, staring at the pile of bones and leathery old skin. The father approached me, hanging his head in shame. "It was my wife that I wanted you to see," he said. "This has been going on for years. I can't take it anymore."